Alright people, so today we're going to be working on our painting techniques, and we're going to do painting techniques a little bit differently, and in doing so we're going to actually be painting them directly onto a painting like you see here. So if you notice, each one of these painting techniques is both labeled with a technique and it has a number in front of it. The number is actually the order of operation, and the reason why we're doing this is to make sure that you always know that you start in the background and then you slowly work closer and you do everything that's behind first, and then the details that are right on top go as some of the last things. So notice this little bush over here, and then this tree are number 9 and number 6. They're very later on. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So back here in the sky, we have to blend for a sky. So you need to decide on colors that make sense for a sky. So it could be sunset colors, it could be midday colors, whatever works for you, we're going to do that. So I'm going to start out by putting my base color down. So I'm going to paint over it. I'm going to outline this area because that area doesn't really need to be blended. And remember to make sure that your paintbrushes don't have a ton of water in them. And if you can't cover up that part that says the painting technique, don't worry about it because this isn't your final painting. This is just your practice for your painting techniques. Alright, so blending is when you're mixing two different colors together and basically showing a gradient effect. So I've painted over that, and now because this is one of the last areas that I have to paint, it's actually okay if I get some paint in there because I'm going to paint over top of it later on. It's one of the reasons. So now I'm going to wash out my paintbrush, wipe it off, blot off the extra water, and I'm ready to come down with my second color. So before even touching that first color that we put down, I'm going to outline everywhere that I want this lighter color. And it's important with blending that you start with a darker color, or you start with a darker color first, and then you blend the lighter color on top, because although sometimes it likes to eat it up. Alright, so now blending. Notice how I'm slowly working back and forth and bringing that lighter color on top. Just like that, and they're mixing together, and then I can come down and I can bring it down a little bit. The important thing with blending is that you're using long brush strokes and that you're mixing the two colors together. I can bring it down here. So effective blending at the end, you should be able to see the first color, a second in between color, and then the original second color, just like that. So it's a smooth transition from one color to the next. And it might look a little bit shiny right now because the paint's still wet, but in a little bit it'll look more consistent. Alright, so I'm washing off my paintbrush now, drying it off, and I'm ready to move on to number 2. So this one was number 1, now number 2's over here. So back here, we don't really see a painting technique, but we do see this thing that says overpaint right here. So this is 2 and 3. So overpainting is when you paint on top of something once it's totally dry. So it's important that we paint these two areas first so that later on we can come back and do this overpainting to show the difference between those two areas. And I apologize if our computer just froze. It'll catch up in a second. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start out with mountain color. I'm going to go ahead and just go with brown. And the other reason why I'm having you guys do this landscape color like this is I really want you to realize that mountains are not just zigzags, that there is a high and a low point, and it's important to represent that when you're making mountains in your own artwork. Okay, so I outline my area just like this, and I'm outlining, and then I can come back in and I can fill in these areas. Now if you're having problems with your paint being really, really thin, it's because you have too much water in your paintbrush. So having a little bit of an issue with that, and notice that I'm going back and I'm actually making this outline and fill in, and I'm smoothing out what I've already painted to make it look a little bit neater. Now things that are in the background are lighter, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do a wet on wet color technique, which means that I'm painting a wet color on top of another wet color. And I'm doing that to show the difference in that edge. So I'm going to pick up just a little bit of darker color, and I'm going to paint them directly on top of each other. So this is color mixing, just like that, but it's color mixing that happens directly on the paper. So I'm doing a little bit of wet on wet right here. I'll do some darker down here, and then I'll bring that brown back in. And wet on wet can also be mixed with a little bit of blending, but mainly it's color mixing that you don't use a plate for, you don't use a palette, you don't use anything like that. You just mix directly on the paper. So here we go. And again, because this tree is one of the last things that I'm painting in, I don't have to be nearly as neat as I might be if I had to paint it sooner. So there we go. I have a wet on wet right here, and I'll use overpainting later on to make that show up. Okay, so washing out our paintbrush, and we did 1, 2, 3, and so now we're moving on to this grassy area right back here. So this area, I'm going to work on just outline fill in. I could also do some wet on wet color mixing, I can do some blending, experiment with one of the two that we just talked about. So again, remember, as things get farther away, they're lighter and less detailed, and as things get closer, they become darker and more detailed. So I'm outlining the area. It's always best to outline first so that you don't accidentally paint in the wrong area. Notice that the 4 also goes over here, and that's a really common mistake for a lot of us, is that we don't realize that maybe we have grass in 2 different areas, or maybe even 3 different ones. And this one has another little spot of grass over here underneath this tree. So it's important to outline, fill in, and recognize where things are. And if you need to number, like I've gone through and done here, you're welcome to do that. So I have that. And then if I want to add a little bit of wet on wet color mixing or blending, I can bring in a second color, just like that, and mix it in and lighten it up in the background, just like that. Okay, so next things. Number 5, our little stream. Painting it in, again, our outline fill in. I can show some dry brush effects once this area dries, but dry brush must be done with a dry brush on top of another dry area. Now, another thing a lot of us forget when we talk about painting techniques is the fact that these painting techniques almost always require another color underneath it before you get started. So I can't do this sponge technique or this dabbing technique until I have a base color down. So I did 5, now I need to do 6, which is over here in our sponge area, and then I'm also going to do a little bit of the tree down here, the stump. Can't really see that number, so it's okay to just go ahead and do it. Alright, so for my tree area, so since I want to sponge on top, I want to think about how I'm going to sponge a lighter color. So I'm going to do some color mixing. Now, we've talked a little bit about complementary colors in the past, but let's talk about them again. So a complementary color is a color that's across from another color on the color wheel. And what happens is when you mix 2 complementary colors together, they make each other darker, almost turn into a brown color. But it's better than just using straight up brown because it like blends a little bit better, it mixes a little bit better than just adding brown. So the complementary color to green is red. So I'm going to mix just a little bit of red in here, darken it up, just like you see here. Make it a little bit darker, even bring in some more red. And again, this is a wet on wet color mixing that I'm doing here, and then I can sponge on top of it later on. So I've made that nice and dark. I can even come back, maybe I made it too dark, and add a little bit more green into it, whatever works for me. So I will come back and do that sponge technique in just a few minutes, and again, it's getting very wet right now, so, but our sky is starting to dry again, so we're good. Let's talk about doing this tree. So again, we can talk about those complementary colors. I'm sorry, this is starting to stick. So we can talk about those complementary colors for this tree area. So this thing was number 6, number 7, and number 8. So I can add this here. I'm going to hold it, paint around it, and I want to make sure that when I have 2 shapes like this that are overlapping each other, that I actually paint them 2 different colors where they overlap. So then again, I'll do that wet on wet here. And then to make them those different colors that I just mentioned, I'm going to take that complementary color of red, and I'm just going to kind of almost like outline it with that red, just like that. And now I can come in and mix those two together, which is blending. Blending doesn't have to be done with just white and blue. Blending doesn't have to happen just on a sky. Blending can happen in a tree to show a highlight or a shadow. That's when we say highlights and shadows, we're really just saying blend another color into this to show that it's either lighter or darker. So now again, I'm having that same issue with down here, that I have the same color grass. So I'm going to take that complementary color and I'm just going to kind of outline it, maybe put it along down here so it becomes a different color, and then I'm going to mix it in. And I pay attention to how my brush strokes go to make sure that it all makes sense. And then just like that. So after you guys do this, we are going to watch and see how to add the painting techniques other than outline and fill and blend and wet on wet to our final picture. So go ahead and get started.